I've always been a person who values silence and solitude. My whole life, I lived in a noisy city, in a cramped apartment where you could hear other people's lives through the walls, a neighbor's crying baby, the thud of music from upstairs, arguments next door. My biggest dream was to have a house of my own, a quiet corner where the only sounds would be the creak of floorboards under my feet and the whisper of the wind outside my window. Finally, after saving enough money, I made that dream a reality. I bought an old house standing on its own at the end of a long abandoned road. The house was exactly what I wanted: 2 stories, with a cracked facade and a tiled roof overgrown with moss. For miles around, there was nothing but forest. For the first few weeks, I enjoyed the bliss. I unpacked my things, getting used to the new sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The house had very little furniture, and the echo of my footsteps reverberated through the empty rooms. One day, while clearing out the junk in the attic, I stumbled upon something large and flat, wrapped in a thick, time-darkened cloth. It was pushed into the farthest corner, buried under old chests and broken furniture. It was obvious that someone had wanted to hide it very well. Curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the junk aside and, with some effort, dragged my discovery into the light. It was a mirror. It was huge, set in a heavy, ornate frame of blackened oak. Carved into the corners of the frame were strange, distorted faces that seemed to be caught between weeping and laughing. I wiped the dust from the glass. It was old, with faint, cloudy imperfections, but there was a strange, alluring depth to it. I decided that such an object shouldn't be left to gather dust in the darkness. I struggled to carry it downstairs and hung it in my bedroom, directly across from my bed. It fit the room perfectly, giving it a touch of antique, Gothic charm. I admired my reflection for a moment and, satisfied, went about my day. I should have left it in the attic. I noticed the first oddity a couple of days later. I was standing in front of the mirror, brushing my teeth. For a split second, I thought my reflection blinked just a fraction of a second after I did. I froze, staring intently. No, everything was fine. The reflection was perfectly mimicking my every move. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, a sign of fatigue. But then it happened again. I was fixing my hair, and a shadow of a smile flickered across my reflection's face, even though my own expression was completely serious. A faint, barely noticeable smirk that vanished in an instant. A feeling of unease settled over me. I walked away from the mirror, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The discrepancies became more and more apparent. One day, I was simply standing and looking straight ahead, but my double in the mirror slowly, almost imperceptibly shifted its gaze to the side toward the window before snapping its eyes back to meet mine. It happened so fast that I once again questioned my own sanity. I started to think that the solitude was getting to me. The real horror began about a week later. I woke up in the middle of the night with a sudden intense feeling of cold. The room was dark, with only moonlight striping the floor. I turned my head toward the mirror, and my heart stopped. I was lying in bed, but my reflection was sitting up. It was perched on the edge of the bed inside the mirror, its back to me, and it was slowly turning its head as if to look directly at me. I screamed and scrambled out of bed, fumbling for the light switch. Light flooded the room. I looked into the mirror. It reflected an empty bed and me standing in the middle of the room, trembling with fear. Everything was normal. It was a dream, a nightmare. I tried to convince myself of that until sunrise, not daring to turn off the light again. I started avoiding the mirror. I tried not to look at it, walking past with my eyes averted. But it didn't help. I began to see wrong reflections in other surfaces. In the dark glass of the window at night, I would see my double standing right behind me. On the blank screen of the kitchen TV, I saw its face flash for an instant, wearing that same awful smirk. It was always the same version of me, slightly paler, with darker eyes and that faint, sinister smile. It was haunting me in my own home. One day, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a heavy blanket from the bed and threw it over the mirror. The room immediately felt safer, cozier. That night, for a first time in a long while, I fell into a peaceful sleep. But the peace was short-lived. In the dead of night, a sound awoke me. A quiet, persistent scratching. It was coming from the mirror, as if someone was clawing at the blanket from the other side, from the inside. I shot up in bed, my breath caught in my throat. I stared at the blanket hanging motionless on the frame, listening to that quiet, maddening sound. Then it stopped. I stood like that until morning, my eyes fixed on the covered mirror. At dawn, I worked up the courage. With a sharp tug, I ripped the blanket away. Nothing. Just my own terrified face staring back at me from the glass. The reflection perfectly mirrored my movement, my sigh of relief. But I knew he was there. He had just hidden himself again. That night, I decided I'd had enough. I wouldn't hide in my own home anymore. I would sit in a chair and watch it all night, no matter what happened. I placed a chair facing the mirror, turned on a small lamp, and I waited. Hour after hour passed. Nothing happened. My reflection sat in its chair, an exact copy of me. My eyelids grew heavy. I had almost convinced myself that it was all a product of my frayed nerves and was about to go to bed. And then, the air in the room turned ice cold. Not just chilly, but freezing like a winter forest. My breath plumed in front of me. I looked into the mirror. The reflection in the chair was gone, but the room in the mirror was not empty. My double was standing by the bed. He was standing right where I had been sleeping all those nights. He slowly turned and looked at me. His face was fixed in a wide, triumphant smile. Slowly, deliberately, he began to walk toward the surface of the mirror. I was paralyzed with terror, unable to move or make a sound. He came right up to the glass. He raised a hand and touched the surface with his fingertips. The mirror rippled like water. I watched horrified as he began to emerge, distorting as if passing through a layer of liquid mercury from the mirror into my room. First a hand, then a shoulder, then his head. He was stepping out of the reflection and into the real world. In moments, he was standing on the floor of my bedroom. Real. Solid. I expected him to lunge at me, to kill me, but he didn't. He just stood there,
watching me with that same horrible smile. Then he slowly walked around my chair and stood behind me. I could feel his icy breath on the back of my neck. He leaned in close to my ear, and for the first time I heard his voice. It was my voice, but quiet and sibilant, like the rustle of dry leaves. "Silence," he whispered. And then he pushed me. The push wasn't strong, but it had an unnatural force. I didn't fall from the chair. I was thrown backward, straight into the mirror. For a moment, the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of cold, liquid fragments. And then I was on my feet, in my bedroom. But everything was wrong. The colors were dull. The air was still and dead. There were no sounds. None at all. I looked forward. I could see my room, but it was on the other side of some invisible barrier. And in my room stood him, my double. He walked over to the chair I had just been sitting in, ran a hand over it. Then he turned and looked at me. He smiled, walked to the invisible wall and placed his palm against it. I did the same. Our hands met, separated by the cold, smooth surface. He looked at me, his prisoner, trapped in a timeless, silent copy of my own room. And then he turned away and walked toward the door to begin living my life. I am still here, in this world without sound. I scream, but my screams have no voice. I beat my fists against the glass, but the impacts are silent. I see him every day. He lives in my house. Sometimes he walks up to the mirror and just looks at me, and he smiles. And all I can do is watch. Watch him live my life while I am trapped here in my own reflection.